right now that can take into account some of these extreme heat and wildfire smoke mitigation actions. So be thinking about that as we talk, because we are going to look for your input in just a little bit. Okay, next slide. So continuing to kind of revise the outline of what this final memo will look like. You'll see now the title is about adding extreme heat and wildfire smoke to more broadly local and regional plans. So this is kind of the section outline that we modified and will continue to work on. We'll have some background on public health risks to the region, this screening tool that will kind of replace what would typically be an exposure analysis in a hazard mitigation plan. And that screening tool can sort of spit out an initial problem statement, and then we'll have a mitigation action list that feeds into additional plans that could integrate those actions, and then wrap up with some funding options. So next slide. This is kind of this in development screening tool that we've been reworking as we've been in the midst of this workshop. So it could look something like this. And as you're looking at this, please add to the chat what is missing from this set of questions based on what you've heard so far. So the screening tool would look at a sort of city or countywide susceptible populations, taking those two lists from the previous slides and starting to look at data sets and map those, and then move from the city or county scale down to a neighborhood level, which can tell a different story. And then adding additional social vulnerability factors. So again, recognizing that there are a few different things at work in this region on social vulnerability toolkits. So integrating what some of those additional factors may look like. And so we'll list those out in this screening tool, but have sort of a placeholder for if your particular community defines social vulnerability in a different way or wants to add something, there'd be a space to do that. Identifying where there are homeless shelters, assisted living, and affordable housing, which can also be a proxy for social vulnerability. We know that we can map city-wide heat exposure and then get more fine-grained down to the neighborhood or even block level. And then for wildfire smoke risk there in the second column, we can pull some information from the state hazard mitigation plan, which I was rereading the section on wildfires last night, again, because you can map where wildfires are going to happen, but that doesn't necessarily tell you exactly where the smoke is going to blow to. So you can kind of make some almost blanket statements about increased wildfire smoke risk for the region. So we'll go ahead and add some language like that in this screening tool. You can also map overall tree cover and imperviousness as a proxy for urban heat island impacts, including next one is distance from and transport to hospital emergency departments, which can basically result in worse outcomes for people if it takes them too long in the midst of an asthma attack during a smoke event to get to the emergency room. And then lastly, location of any cooling or clean air centers that already exist. So that's sort of our starter list for this screening tool. Again, if you're thinking of things as you look at this, feel free to add them to the chat. But then the next slide, if you want to go to that one, Laura, again, this would produce a product of an example problem statement that would kind of summarize everything that map might tell you, or those data sets. And one other thing just to mention that was a really useful bit of the conversation on Tuesday was that for some of those items in that screening tool, we know that there are biases inherent to how that data can be collected. And so we could add some questions that recognize some questions that we would want to ask that we don't necessarily have the answers to, or we think that the data may be incomplete. Okay, I'll pause there just for a quick second and see if anybody has any immediate comments or thoughts on sort of where we've started to take this final document and what we think we may produce.
Hi, this is Natalie from the city of Milwaukee. I could notice for the tree cover, is that dispersed across each property and tax lot, or are you also looking at open green spaces or shared recreation spaces in proximity to more of these larger kind of natural areas? Because I would imagine that, at least in our community, we do have neighborhoods that are very low tree cover, but there is a proximity to maybe a larger, more continuous green space. And I'm curious on if that would have any sort of impact.
I think, yeah, it would be the latter as well. We would include those public spaces as well. But as I understand it, there's just some existing data and mapping tools around overall tree cover, but that would include not just private, but that public property as well, like a percentage tree canopy.
I'd almost suggest breaking out the two of them and looking
Okay.
at them separately, just because I'm sure that there's some, or there may be some benefits to being within walking distance of a larger natural space, as well as canopy cover or some sort of undeveloped vegetation on lots.
So like
Yeah,
park proximity almost.
Yes, yeah.
I think that really resonates with me, Natalie. I think that you're measuring two separate things. You're measuring kind of the tree canopy and how that influences the heat island effect or not, or lack thereof, and then the parks or natural areas act almost as a cooling center in their own right, not in a smoke event, but in a heat event, where it's a place where people can have some respite from the heat. Maybe you have, include public fountains or something else where people can actually like get wet and cool their bodies.
Yeah, and we do see trees. I mean, when we're looking at trees, a lot of times we're looking at the building level because of the cooling properties for adjacent buildings and shading proximately right underneath. And then, of course, there are air quality benefits and cooling benefits overall for shading the pavement. But there's also definitely access to the green spaces as a cooling source, like you mentioned, but then also the mental health and other kind of physical benefits that larger green spaces provide.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. That's exactly the type of specific feedback we're looking for. Anybody else?
Hi, Brenna here from the city of Milwaukee. Would you be able to go back to the slide where we had bulleted out all of the things that we were kind of trying to make sure we gathered? Because one thing that I noticed, and maybe this was encompassed in another bullet, is accessibility to public transportation and or accessibility to your own personal transportation, because that's a factor in terms of if folks need to get to a shelter, how they access them. And then obviously where we're planning to have shelters, we want to make sure that they're accessible via all modes of transportation as well. So just another, I think, screening question or factor to consider.
I think that would probably fall under that additional social vulnerability factors. That makes sense to you to add like transit access under there? Yeah. Just this is maybe a side note, but I think it's relevant here. My office has been talking to like FEMA about their national risk index and how they came up with their social vulnerability measures there, and thinking about some of our work moving forward in this new administration on climate justice, and working from some other tools out there. There's one called Environmental Justice Screen, and I know the state of California has one that's pretty well defined. There are a few different systems out there. I think that it would be useful to look at some of the like basic categories or templates that you could modify. And that's what I would almost want to pop under that additional social vulnerability factors. And for your community, you could like add or subtract them as you saw fit. But I think transit access is definitely one. It's sort of encompassed in that distance from and transport to hospital emergency department. But your point is, I think, a bigger one. So yeah, I would add that there.
Are you also looking at proximity to like large emitters, like proximity to DEQ reportable emitters of industry or energy generation, et cetera?
Yeah, and I noticed again with Abe Mullen sent the Clackamas County, and like they just have one that has for heat exposure. They have like lives in a neighborhood with high urban heat impacts, and so there's certainly some other things in there, or neighborhoods with certain consistent high AQI or air quality index scores. So again, that's a place where I think like our EPA has an EJ screen tool, which would show you a neighborhood that's in close proximity to certain polluters or emitters. So
because you could use the state's DEQ air quality monitoring reports to at least identify the larger emitters. Maybe for at least for industry, and then kind of a proximity around there. I don't know if that's captured in that EPA tool or not, but at least at the state level, we have that data.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right, I think that is a good one to add because the air quality issue is so big on both of these hazards. Other thoughts? This is maybe a good point to mention something that as we develop the final report, I would love anybody that wants to be a reviewer for that, or maybe you want to contribute a little more in the final development. That we'll be sort of asking for volunteers if you want to be on that review team, just to double check what we've got before we finalize it and make sure we're not missing something. I would love closer eyes on this, making sure that we capture all of your input and feedback today as we expand this list for this screening tool. We can put you on a short list and promise not to spam you too much with too many questions, but would love your closer eyes on it later when you've got time. Okay, I think we can go on, Laura, to start the breakout groups. So we've already split you all into groups. We're going to have 6 groups total, 3 groups focused on heat, 3 groups focused on wildfire smoke. Thank you to a couple of our volunteers who are going to help facilitate. So each group will have a facilitator who's going to lead you through these 4 questions. We'll have about 20 minutes or so to talk through them. And if you go to the next slide really quick, Laura, each of your facilitators will pull up a document that is basically our notes, our detailed notes we've been keeping throughout this project to collect a set of mitigation actions. And again, you'll be either in the heat or the smoke group. And so this is just an example of the one that we have developed for extreme heat. And you'll see we've got a few columns that just sort of categorize the actions, list them out. The next column is it FEMA eligible? Don't worry about that one. We're actually going to have a follow-up meeting, hopefully with OEM, to review this list before we finish the document to get their input on which ones might be eligible for hazard mitigation planning grant funds. Hazard mitigation plans usually have that in a table like this, just so planners know which ones are eligible for those FEMA dollars. But then the other thing we want your feedback on today more pointedly is this column on plan integration. Are there specific plans that you think of that connect to a given action that it could go back and be added to that upcoming plan update, or something that you or a colleague is working on? And then the other one that we want to know about is, do you think it could count as a regional action? And you'll see when they open up this table, there is a whole category on regional actions, but we think a lot of them could also double up and be counted as regional. Things like each city could develop their own smoke readiness website, but what if maybe that's one that could just serve the entire region, and everybody inputs into a single one rather than have 5 different ones across the region. So go back one more, Laura, again to those questions. So again, we're going to be overall, what actions are missing? What did we just completely forget or do we not know about yet? 2, which actions could be counted as regional? 3, what other plans should we be thinking about? And then connected to that one, what other groups or agencies would we need to engage on that particular action? And you might not get to all of these questions. You might really focus on a couple, and that's fine. Whatever you do, we just want to have a chance for you all to have smaller conversations and get your feedback on these specific actions. And when we come back, we'll all do a report out and we'll take notes, especially on those regional actions, and sort of shift to think about what we could take on sort of across the whole region. So I think with that, Laura, unless you have other... I
have one additional thing. I don't think you said this, but since we only have 20 minutes, it's great to do a very brief introduction on who's in the room with you. But if, just keep it really quick because our time is pretty short.
Okay, great. So with that, I'm going to push people to breakouts, and I pre-assigned you. So if by your email that you registered with. So if for some reason you don't end up in a room, I'll work to get you into one shortly. Like Abby said, it'll be 20 minutes. I'll try to remember here. I'll give like a 3-minute warning, and then you'll have another warning when it's 1 minute before we come back to the group. All right. Good luck, everybody. Okay, so Sasha, Abby, it did not do the CSV file that I pre-uploaded. So I'm gonna make breakout rooms, and then I'm gonna probably have to move some of you who are moderators. So just bear with me for a couple minutes. Don't know what happened, guys.
No worries.
Okay.
We were ahead of time anyway, so.
Yeah, I'm really sorry because we had them all pre-built out. So I'm gonna just need a moment.
Yeah, don't feel rushed.
Okay, I'm gonna say this. Sasha, can you maybe kick off the conversation? I'm gonna bring Abby back into the room and I'm gonna work on this on the side. It might just take me a few minutes because I actually have to rebuild them.
Yes, I'm going to start sharing the heat mitigation actions. I think this is going to work. Can people
Okay.
see that?
If we can consume a few minutes in a group discussion, I will hopefully get it reset up. Thank you.
So since there's a bunch of us, you know, we'll try it by having people talk about it. But if it gets a little crazy, we might want to have people do it in the chat. So whichever you're more comfortable with, it add it in the chat. But so the questions here are, as we move through this list, is it something that we think is a regional action, or do you think it's better to happen at the local level? And then other plans or plans in particular, and if you know of other funding sources, add those as well. So starting at the top of the list, do we feel like improving urban heat data collection is something that could be done on the regional level? We have some data folks in the room. I would love to hear from them.
I'm sort of a data person.
Yes, you are, Joe. That's you.
Yeah, I think it could, you know, if you wanted to go the route of what Vivek Shandis does methodologically, then definitely you could improve the urban heat data collection, because we definitely don't have any standardized sort of implementation of what he does. It's, you know, putting a PVC pipe with a little GPS thing and a thermometer on a car. Yes, that's definitely doable, and it's something I feel like we could do as well. But you know, I'm sure there's some logistical nuts and bolts that it took them some time to iron out and figure out. Fairly confident we could do that too. But it also comes back to sort of another question of what the use of the data is. And people have been studying urban heat islands at regional scales using satellite data for decades, right? It's lower resolution, but if you're comparing it to demographic data, which is inherently lower resolution, then maybe that's fine, right? So it kind of depends on what the use of that data is. For me, the satellite urban islands at a regional scale, when I'm doing big metro-wide regional analysis, comparing it to census tracts and trying to understand generalized trends, satellite is fine, right? But if you're zooming into a tract and trying to do more site-specific planning, maybe implementing some specific policy on the ground for something in that neighborhood, then maybe that the detail that his approach provides you is a good thing. And so that's kind of what I wrestle back and forth with, is sort of what is the level of effort? Because you got that satellite data going around and around all the time, and it can go back in time as well. So you can kind of measure changes over long periods of time and correlate that with demographics as well. So kind of, you know, balancing what is the level of effort, what are we doing with that data, and having that kind of inform the path forward. But it would be great to, I think, do both. They're both good data sets, and they're kind of answering two different questions and getting at two different things at different levels of detail, you know. So those are kind of my thoughts on that whole subject as I wrestle with it from sort of a data point of view.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
Hey, Sasha, you may know this, but I think the whole group's here. You're not in a.
Yes.
Okay.
You know, we started because we thought we'd just give it. Yeah, we did start.
I'd be curious to hear what other people think about that, you know, because other people, I know that his work has been read a lot, and I know it's pretty popular, and it is really fine detail. And so maybe other people are imagining specific uses for that level of detail that are out there, you know.
Hey, I'm just gonna break in and say, let's finish this conversation over the next. I do have the breakouts assigned now, so I'll be able to push people into the smaller groups. Really sorry for that technical glitch, but in 1 minute I'll push people out. Go ahead, Jay.
I just wanted to follow up and ask about the possibility of citizen scientists. While it might be novel, it may not be, you know, standardized or duplicative. But between all of the folks who are volunteers with the Weather Service for weather monitoring in a capacity like that to generate, you know, lots of community-based data points, and I'm especially thinking about something they do in the post-earthquake field, where they'll assign a building structure as a model, for example, for aftershocks, and they'll assign a brick building that they can go monitor, and every time there's an aftershock, they'll go monitor that building to see how it's damaged. If we're monitoring certain classes of buildings and how they hold heat or retain heat, you know, in areas that are more warm versus more that not, you know, we might think about how to designate places that give us baselines on certain types of either buildings or areas that way.
Yeah, it's a good point, Jay. That is something that Vivek brought up as well. The kind of community engagement, citizen science component of that whole process is pretty unique and valuable too.
Okay, I'm gonna cut in and say, keep the conversation going. I'm gonna push you to a room. You're gonna be assigned either a smoke or a heat room. There's about 4 or 5 of you in each room, and there is an assigned facilitator. So keep it to 20 minutes and enjoy the discussions.
We're the only group that came back.
We responded. We were very diligent about responding to your message that we should come back.
Yeah, I think it forces everybody in like
another. There's a couple seconds left.
I'll be here.
Laura, as we do this, do you want us to share our screens or as the facilitators, or what do you think?
We could. I was going to ask Abby when she got back if she is. Hey, Abby.
Okay.
Ready. So as we do the report outs, Abby, do you have a preference if we have the slide deck up, or do you want to actually have the facilitators share screens?
If they can, if they want to share screens, I think that's great. We can kind of see what people did. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's set up so that one participant can share screen at a time. So as we go through the group report outs, if you have one that you want to share, feel free to do that.
Yeah, and why don't I'll keep time on all of you. So when you've got up to a little over 3 minutes, I'll just wave my hand like this to tell you your time is up. So quick reminder, we're looking for what actions we're missing, which ones are regional, additional planning documents, and other groups or agencies, and then of course anything else that was interesting that came out of your group. So Laura, I think you had a better sense of who all of our leads were, although I think Molly, you were one of our facilitators. You want to go first?
Sure. Can I say one thing before you start, Molly? Sorry.
Yeah.
If, to keep it shorter, if some other group has said the thing that you have to say, you can just, skip it. Just add the things that are new and different. And if you disagree with another group, that's cool too. But if you're just piling on, let's just keep it short.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Get you over here. All right, can you see that? Okay, so we only made it through assessment and the communications and outreach. And that's as far as we got, but we had really great discussion. So again, our group was focusing on smoke. So for the first action, identifying other sources of smoke and air pollution, considering policies to limit unnecessary emissions during smoke events. We said that this is a regional action. We had a little bit of discussion on whether or not we should be considering multiple layers of data in considering smoke impacts. Like when we had the major wildfire recently and that major impact of smoke came in, we weren't really considering what the impacts were of like industrial sites and other, big emitters like that. So that was a question that came up in conversation. For the next one, evaluating air filtration systems. So we did say that other funding sources and plan integration, OEM has a response plan for this. And we talked about, how the smoke impacts will be integrated into the response plan, what agency will be the lead, what ESF will be responsible for it. So we had a lot of questions in our discussion as well. But we definitely said this was a regional effort because clean air centers were definitely needed during the wildfire, and being able to pinpoint where those were for local folks and the wider region would be really helpful. So coordination is important. So moving on to communications, outreach, and education. For public education and preparedness, we said, yes, this is a regional action. There are, of course, some areas that are going to be more susceptible, more vulnerable populations are there. So they might need more focus, but having public education and preparedness be a regional effort where there's kind of just like a formalized baseline of just general education would be really important. I included the Clackamas County Preparedness Campaign. We have that at a county level, but I don't know if it goes too much outside of that. And the last one, next one, targeted outreach for different audiences and different languages. We said, yes, this should be a regional action. Joe mentioned that Metro follows Title VI compliance, where documents are translated into languages. The same approach could be applied to this communication. One thing I noted is that for translation services, if that was a collaboration across the region to translate documents or anything into different languages, there's some areas of the county or of the region that have a higher population of folks speaking a language, and being able to share those services and share documents with that would be really helpful for preparedness. So the contact and monitor high risk groups is kind of the same as this targeted outreach piece. So we skipped that one for time. And the last one we got to was workforce protections, the guidance for inspector or supervisor for field work during wildfire and smoke events. And we said, yes, of course, this is important to be regional. Just having general guidelines for everyone in the region to follow would be really important. We did note that so in Clackamas County, there's a lot more rural areas than other counties have in the region. So that might lead to some differences in guidance, but I think in general, having a more formalized just guidance for the region would be really helpful for all of us. So I'll stop there. And if I missed anything, my team, feel free to jump in and share anything.
All right, thanks, Molly. All right, well, let's stick with smoke. Genevieve, do you want to go next?
Sure. Let me share my screen. So Molly is a lot more organized than I am. I completely panicked and forgot what all the columns were titled. So I just put everything in bold in the chat that we talked about. But I'll go back and clean it up later. So we had a lot of great conversations about what we already have on the chart. I don't think we added any. Well, we did have one regional action, but so let's see. For air pollution, we had a debate about whether we should talk about air pollution in general or just focus on wildfire smoke. We want to focus only on natural hazards because the point was brought up that FEMA will not pay for human-caused hazards. So thinking of air pollution as sort of the baseline, and then wildfire smoke is an extra air pollutant on top of that. So some communities put both in plans, which is fine, but you can't charge FEMA. So we wanted to be clear on that point. So I'll put that in the funding notes. Another thing we talked about is that the time component is sometimes missing with this looking at air pollution and how people kind of understand the health impacts of wildfire smoke over time. So how does the length of exposure impact human health outcomes? And we need to think about that when communicating with the public. For clean air shelters, we had a lot of conversation about what it actually takes for a clean air shelter to exist. Does it need to be specifically built for that purpose, or can it be any building that has enough filters or retrofitting done? And we also wanted to, we reiterated this point a few times, that we have to buy filters well before summer happens, because once there's smoke, the filters are not available anywhere. But COVID might have actually helped with this, because a lot of public buildings have switched to stronger filters already. So that's it. I thought that was an interesting point. And then talking about transportation options, how do you get to a shelter? If it's not safe to even leave your house, then what can you do? So maybe having a tiered plan in place would be a good idea for public awareness. You know, like you should get to a shelter, but if you can't, then do this. So having like those levels of things you can do would be helpful. In terms of comms, outreach, and education, we didn't really stick to the categories that directly, as you can probably tell. So I'll just keep talking about what we talked about. Having some supplies before the smoke comes, again, we wanted to reiterate that point. Advertising burn bans more effectively. People don't necessarily always know when they're in place. We also talked about clarity around what high-risk groups actually are, and having good criteria that people easily understand how they fit into. So there's no miscommunication on that. And then just a general question to think about: who are the proper people to contact those groups when these wildfires happen? So thinking about communication networks. For workforce protections, apparently OSHA and other government agencies might actually need some education themselves on this issue. Since during the last fire event, OSHA didn't have great guidance or necessarily even understand the severity of the event. So we might need to think about that. Somebody mentioned that updating building codes could be moved to a regional action since it's a statewide or regional, I guess, planning process and it's not local. Let's see. Does somebody from my group want to talk about this point that we made, thinking about types of plans that would be relevant to smoke? I can't remember exactly what that was about.
Sure, I can chime in. So this idea was that as we think about other plans that could be used to increase resilience, thinking about specifically what those plans have to offer. So for example, for a comprehensive plan, for a land use plan, what are the pieces that it could have? We talked about thinking about policies around shelters and what kinds of zoning or land use would be required for them, considering whether or not those shelters would need to be custom built or if it was just a short-term permit that sort of any building could serve that function, which circled back to the question of what does it even take to be a clean air shelter, and having more clarity on those sort of built-in requirements.
Great, thanks, Sarah, appreciate that. And then for our last point, we just added on to the regional actions, having regional level guidance for employers, since there are utilities and other industries that cross boundaries. So it's good to have that consistency. And that's it.
All right, thank you, Genevieve. In the interest of time, I'm going to forfeit my spot. My group can trust that I will carry forth the notes into the final document. So moving on to extreme heat. Anthony, you want to go?
Sure. Good. All right. Hopefully you can see it. So I highlighted our additions on it to try to make it a little bit easier to call out. So we added a few. We kind of jumped around a little bit, and anybody in my group, feel free to jump in if I miss anything. Started with on the assessment, adding a couple actions. Assessing what homes have cooling and ventilation capabilities or proper insulation properties, and working with the Energy Trust of Oregon, local utilities to do that. Also could be a regional action, as well as collection of who is impacted greatest based on vulnerabilities. And then moving down into the comms, outreach, and education. As part of the public outreach and preparedness, including benefits of tree covers and enormous urban forestry to help promote them, and that being a regional action, jurisdictions also work with the local watershed councils as a way to help promote that. With targeted outreach for different audiences and in different languages. I may have put this in the wrong category, but historic anniversaries of high impact events locally or elsewhere to provide context to high heat events and the impacts that they can have on communities, to help communities understand the impacts that they can have. With the demonstrations in vulnerable areas, we're hoping that we read that action correctly with demonstrations of weatherization, utilities, programs, components, or home upgrades or retrofits, as well as public installations that promote demonstrations in high heat mitigation strategies. And these could be almost like a sort of a public art sort of space or demonstration on how something like urban forests provide cooling. I think we talked about how those can be regional as well. With the local codes and actions, as part of improving public transportation access and vehicle access restrictions, supporting the reduction of off-street parking and to help reduce asphalt use, which promotes higher heat. Changing zoning laws to allow more green space and street trees, making sure that this is all included into comprehensive plan updates, and also working with local utility action plans, climate action plans, urban forest plans, And then some of the ones that we added that are kind of included in that, in some of those, but the local tree codes for communities, public health benefits of trees and urban forests. And it was noted this includes jurisdiction-wide succession planning for tree cover and urban forests to promote healthy and full canopy coverage. So as you lose your larger trees, you're replacing with trees that'll provide adequate canopy cover in the future, not just replacing with small trees. Also with climate adapted species, so making sure that they can survive in our area in the future and have nice, long, healthy lives. And working with public health, public work standards to ensure those are being implemented. Include the urban forestry and climate action plans, and the land use planning and building codes to promote landscape architecture and building design in low income and high density building environments, to ensure that we're using the same practices wherever we build within the city and that anybody can take advantage of them. And then with the regional actions on the bottom, we added asset assessments can be completed at the regional levels, and ensuring that public outreach and education are also done regionally when appropriate.
All right, awesome. You guys did a lot. Thank you, Anthony.
Had a good team.
Yeah, good. Who was on there? Yeah. All right, Mike, do you have a quick report out?
Yep, just trying to share the screen. Whoop, wrong one, I think. Or can you guys see the Word document?
Yes, we could.
Oh.
Didn't say it fast enough, sorry.
So our assessment part was pretty much the same as the last group. The comms and outreach and education, just we want to make sure the messaging coming out is coordinated or as close to the same as possible. And that goes the same for translated stuff for audiences and things. I wanted to add that OEM actually is starting to improve their capability for translated things. So if anyone ever needs that assistance, OEM can provide. I think it's the top 14 languages of Oregon for translating materials and such. And so that was just another thing when we were talking through. Knowing who your community-based organizations are and who knows the community best, even outside your own jurisdiction, is a thing that we thought would be good to be able to do for a regionalized area. A lot of the stuff was the same. Contact and monitor high-risk groups, access into community-based organizations, utilize the knowledge of experienced PIOs. Check facilities provide more target outreach. Well, those are two in the same. It was check the facilities that are providing stuff and then get more outreach. Provide business guidelines for the region as ways to help them out or give them alternatives, maybe even financial incentives to give a business help if they can't have their employees at work that day, just be able to have some sort of unemployment insurance or something that will be able to help them out during that time. And then we were just finishing or just started talking through the create information hotline for the public. And this is, we said to do that, but also do social media as well for the region. So that is all I have.
Okay, great. Sasha has offered to be skipped as well. So Laura, if you want to put up the main slides again. Something that you were just saying, Mike, resonated with me early on when we talked to the MITREC, the Mitigation and Recovery Subcommittee. Engagement and outreach, I feel like, was a common thing that group early on was like, it'd be really great to have some region-wide guidance on outreach and communication. So I'm hearing that idea sort of reiterated from a couple of us and talking about either translation services. And I think that's a great idea, like knowing who the community-based organizations are. So that'll be a good thing for us to think about and work into the final report. So I think next slide, if you want to pull that one up, Laura. Keep going, yep. So on thinking about those regional actions, and I just mentioned the mitigation and recovery group of planners. That group will be sort of the clear place to carry some of this forward and revisits what comes out of this final report. But I think, in reality, when we started this project, Sasha had a position at Metro that no longer exists because of budget cuts. So, we thought Metro might really step into the role of coordinating across the region, and that's not going to quite happen in the same way. And RDPO is an obvious place to carry some of that work forward, but you all are very busy at RDPO. So, in reality, you won't be able to do all that we identify as potential next steps in this report. So one, just kind of question for this group is thinking ahead to when we have this final report ready, who would you like to see receive that? I mean, we'll send it to everybody that participated in this workshop. So you're welcome, of course, to share that and forward it along. But I think, we want to kind of take stock now of, are there others that should be briefed on the project, should know about it, that we should be thinking about now as potential audience members? And then on that last point, we haven't written it yet. We want it to be really useful to you all. What could be included in that final report, final memo to help you move this work forward? So that could be, just like packaging everything into a clean set of PowerPoint slides so that if you want to do those briefings yourself, you kind of have all the information ready to go. So if you have thoughts on that right now, just again, let us know in the chat, or feel free to take yourself off mute. We want to take feedback before we write this thing so that it is useful with you all as sort of the key audience at this point. And Sasha or Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add that we are having conversations right now at the RDPO and the MITREC group. Many members from that group are here today, coming off of this last year where things were so busy with COVID-19 response, recovery, civil unrest and wildfires. We're taking a fresh look at our work plans and priorities. And I think this is really opportune timing that we're having this workshop and have this to help inject some actions that we may be able to take regionally. And we are also in the process of bringing on another planning coordination type of staff, excuse me, that will kind of similar to my role, will be supporting some of the working groups in REMTech. So I'm hopeful that with some of that resource, we'll have opportunity to advance a number of things that are called out. But I agree with Abby, just these topics as well, this spans beyond the RDPO. And I think there's other key partners that we could leverage. So it's helpful for folks to give input on that.
I actually will add one thing. We are also very lucky to have some really great state level partners. I know Marion Lahav from the LCD is on today. We have some Washington state level folks on. So, and I think as we've done this work, it's been very clear that we started out thinking about planning and emergency management, and then kind of expanded to health as another kind of iteration component of this work. So the agency that deals with health at the local and regional and state levels is a really important partnership to engage on. Obviously, OEM in Oregon is a great partner. So, and our group actually talked about some of the pieces maybe making sense to do at a state level, not just at a regional level, especially like direction to work employers, OSHA, and I just want to kind of flag that the governor's executive order around climate change includes some direction related to Oregon Health Authority's work describing, kind of the impacts of climate change on health. And these two things are obviously very climate change related. So that might help people in this conversation as well.
All right, thanks. Okay, next slide, Laura. So kind of also on that point of climate change, thinking forward to funding some of these actions. Again, the plan is to have some of this packaged into the final memo, and some of it's based on what's in that EPA FEMA regional resilience toolkit where we've worked with a bunch of other partners and sort of learned some things about, the importance of selling your projects. But I think this topic's a little different, whereas typically with an infrastructure related resilience project, we would want to talk about making the business case and talking about the return on investment and the costs avoided. And I think this one's a little bit different just because the messaging around the public health angle is less about that cost avoided and a business case maybe than about saving lives and really protecting vulnerable people. So but I think that messaging really resonates with a lot of potential funders. And part of that is also building up your network of funders. And I think just by virtue of this project and coming together with some regional actions, and that goes a long way for a lot of different funders, whether you're talking about potential private financing. Again, that doesn't maybe translate in the same way for some of these issues, though it could, but certainly philanthropic and corporate grants and federal grants really like to see large scale projects across a region, multi-jurisdictional type work. And then, I'm sitting at the EPA, and I just got asked today to help prepare a transition paper for our new administration coming in. And it's a whole different world in the year ahead, quite frankly. We know that at EPA, climate justice is going to be a big priority for the incoming administration, and everything we've been talking about in this project falls in line with that. So I think, public funding is going to be struggling, of course, coming out of this year of COVID. But the priorities are changing a lot around public funding for this type of work. So I think you're in a good position to be setting yourselves up now in this region to identify some of these actions and be ready to take advantage of that. And I don't want to put Edgar on the spot, but I'm going to say your name out loud in case you've heard anything from the FEMA side or want to add anything else, just as my sort of fellow Fed on this call and thinking about funding for mitigation actions.
Sure. Hey, everybody. I think there's definitely opportunities. When we can, working with OEM, there might be some more, I guess, like granular details. But one thing that I'll mention, and I can send out Abby as a follow-up to this. I do have some info that might be useful for the purposes of this meeting. But I think, like planning related activities, using hazard mitigation grant, the grant program 7% funding process, I think would certainly be useful. Additionally, the advanced assistance funding track, and then also the 5% initiative track of funding. All of these kind of have specific and maybe specific uses, but there are some nuance within each one. And I know for the purposes of this meeting, I'll want to keep it short, but I do have actually some good info for you guys. Maybe after this we can chat. That would maybe you can leverage some of that funding a little more strategically.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Edgar.
And I want to add one other thing. The Metro Parks Bond is an opportunity if you can think of a project that aligns with the goals of the Parks Bond funding, which there are some climate goals in there. So if you were creating, expanding green spaces, for example, or tree canopy or things like that, that's another place. And I know Portland also has a Parks Bond, but Metro for the Metro region is a place you might want to also look for funding.
All right, great. All right, next slide, Laura. So taking us from the high level sort of planning we've been doing, we want to bring it down to the ground. So I mentioned this on Tuesday that my office has this Greening America's Communities program, which provides design assistance. And this is just a quick couple of images from a project that we did. Let's see, we published this in 2018. So this was 3 or probably 4 years ago when we actually did the project in the Jade District with Multnomah County and Apana were our key partners. So we've already done one of these right here in this region, and it just shows you the front of the report and then one of these after perspectives, and then down on the bottom left, that's a plan view of this. If any of you know the Fubon shopping center there, we basically worked with that property owner to talk about converting a lot of pavement to green space and opening up sort of a community pass through for walking and biking. So this is just an example of what this type of assistance could produce. And the way that it works is We would pick a project. If you go to the next slide, I think, let's see. Yeah, oh, a few more images of what it looks like. So this is from Little Rock, Arkansas, just to show you. We start out with a before. We do site assessments. That would include things like understanding what the impervious surface coverage and tree coverage is. And then we being an EPA, it's not money to the recipient. EPA spends our budget on hiring an urban design and landscape architecture firm that would actually provide essentially pro bono design assistance. And it's very conceptual design. They're not detailed engineering drawings, but they are what we think of as consensus building designs that, again, sort of translate policy into pretty pictures that people can get excited about. So this was one of our first projects we did in Little Rock, Arkansas, sort of a dead main street, a lot of empty ground floor retail, low foot traffic. So if you go to the next image, this was what our design team developed of, you can do these bump outs, make safer crossings, encourage the trolley to come back down, plant street trees, and, manage a lot of stormwater runoff in these bioswales and add cooling. So this is one of my, I love all the work that I do, but I really like this design assistance because it's one of the places where I've seen real change on the ground. So in Little Rock, they actually took these designs. We had a great implementation meeting where we brought funders together and sort of did like a funders pitch with these designs. And then the next image shows one of the projects that actually got built as a result of this. So they really did, expanded the sidewalk, whole new street trees, these tree wells, these are pervious pavers. And then the next slide, another image of what they actually built there. And this went hand in hand, this was a public investment in public right of way, but it brought in tons of private investment on this street as well. So this is one of the success stories. If you go to the next slide. So this is essentially an opportunity in this region to translate all of this resilience planning and mitigation action identification into a real project. So you all basically have the opportunity now to pick a project to receive this conceptual design assistance pro bono from the EPA. It could be a site level project like we just saw in Little Rock where we pick a particular street. My example here is maybe it's a new cooling center in a public building and a public library where you add green infrastructure and deep paving on the outside. Or it could be a larger neighborhood scale project that's thinking about increasing tree canopy in a high imperviousness neighborhood. So the ask essentially is to come together and pick a project or propose a project by the end of February. Usually this would be a competitive process that EPA would publish nationwide, but we're sort of excited to just dedicate them to these 4 regional resilience projects that we've been doing in the last year, again, to try to sort of move from that policy to ground level project. So what we'll eventually ask for is just a simple, like 1-page letter of request from whoever the partner is, alongside like Laura at RDPO, who's been our main project partner in this phase, and just a 1-page letter saying, yes, we would love to receive this pro bono design assistance from EPA. And then we will hire a consultant team. And the idea is that we could get going by early summer and have a design workshop sometime in maybe late summer. So I think, Laura, did you want to add something else on that one? Or yeah, we can go to the next slide. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of wrap up where we're at with next steps, this has been a really deep engagement with Abby for many months preparing this workshop series. And so I just want to say a huge thank you to Abby for all the time and effort invested with our group. And also a thank you, shout out to, federal partners and state partners who worked with us along the way. The speakers that we brought along. Hope all of that has been really helpful for folks in kicking off these conversations. And a thank you to the MITREC group, because this has been a really challenging year to having these discussions as we're, have all been deployed, multiple times over throughout the year. So thank you so much to that group. And it's really exciting as we wrap this up to think about, what we've identified and how we can carry that forward. As we know, we are all doing NHMP updates on a regular 5-year cycle. We're not all on the same time scale, but these updates are happening continually. And so I think this is really timely for us coming off of, the smoke event that happened for us this year. I think there's a lot of interest, like we saw in the first workshop with elected officials. There's an acknowledgement of these issues facing our communities, and I think it's timely for us to start to integrate them in better ways into our NHMPs and into other plans so that we can leverage resources and make a difference for our communities. So all that to say, you know, a big thanks to Abby, and that her work's not done yet, because they're going to take all that we've discussed in all 3 of these workshops and produce a memo for us by March. And we will be taking that back. Like I said, you know, I think there's a lot of interest in the topics and we want to maintain that interest. So we'll be taking this back to present to the RDPO Policy Committee, Steering Committee, and we may as well take it back to the MPAC folks at Metro, the Policy Advisory Committee. Am I saying that correctly, Sasha? Okay. But I think, you know, it's really timely that we carry the conversation forward even in between while the memo is being developed by Abby, because as she said, the other, I think it's the other 3 or 4 workshops, they've already submitted their concepts for follow-on projects, right? So we're the final in the series. So save the best for last is my motto. So I'll definitely be having conversations with the MITREC committee and with other RDPO members about that project opportunity for us to leverage the design assistance, but want to say, you know, we have all of these other partners here with us for good reason, and I think we remain really open to putting forward a variety of ideas. I would like to look at what everybody, what this kind of sparked for people, what interesting opportunity we could leverage to do some design and move something forward. So please do reach out. My email is on the previous slide if you don't have it. I think most of you have it because I sent the Outlook invites. But I think that's it for next steps at this point. Abby, Sasha, do you guys want to add anything? Okay.
No, thanks everybody. It was really nice to have you involved, and thanks for good breakout groups today. It was nice to hear from a few of you in more detail.
Yeah, if you have other things to follow up, actually maybe we should send out that document since a lot of the groups didn't get all the way through. Send out that smoke or and the heat documents to the participants. So if they have any other thoughts on the ones that we didn't get to, we might want to, you can respond to Laura with those. And yeah, really appreciate all your work, especially today with the breakout groups and throughout the whole process. It's been good.
Okay,
thanks.
Great. Yeah, and when we get the final memo in March, we'll do a process to get that disseminated out. We'll bring it to working group meetings where we have them, and we'll definitely send out by email to everyone who attended, so you'll have a chance to review. But in the meantime, reach out if you have thoughts, particularly about the follow-on project design assistance. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.